This is your latest story is part of a series where you're examining really just questions of waste in the medical industry. Just recap for us some of the big elements of this.
Well, Sam, I'm trying to kind of recast the way we look at all this healthcare spending in this country. I mean, one of the first things to think about is that, we spend a lot of money on healthcare, and that's my money and your money and the money of taxpayers, and all the people getting the treatment are the ones who are paying for the care. And experts estimate that as much as a third of all the money that we're spending on healthcare is wasted. One report by the Institute of Medicine put that number at $765 billion a year wasted. So I've been on a quest to try and identify as many examples of it as I can.
Now, we should be clear that when we talk about, and we have the most expensive healthcare in the world, we spend more than governments normally do when they take care of their entire population. That's only part of, or I'd say, when they have the majority of the responsibility for paying for healthcare. When we talk about waste, like, is this? I mean, just put that in context. Like, when we say waste, is someone making money off that waste? Or
well,
is it
yeah,
just...
I mean, I'm looking at it from the point of view of the patient or the people paying the bills. And this is money that, experts would say does not need to be spent. So from our perspective, it's waste. But of course, this is also the money that's fueling the profits and the revenue of the industry. So for the drug companies, this is their revenue. For the hospitals, this is their revenue. So, the industry doesn't see it as waste, but I'm looking at it from the consumer side, and it is wasted spending.
So we're looking at it from the perspective of how much health do you get for your dollar? And if 20 to 30% of that dollar has nothing to do with your health, but has to do with procedures or has to do with just ways of doing business or ways of marketing or whatever it is, then it's a waste from our perspective. And ultimately, there has to be some other entity involved in this process to curb the waste, right? Because there's, for instance, you and I spoke about the expiration of drugs and how there is a lot of reason to believe that when we looked at that drugs, certain drugs can expire, and they don't in any meaningful sense of the word. But others certainly have much longer times in which they are effective, and that drugs can't necessarily turn dangerous. From our perspective, I mean, there's no manufacturers out there who are going to say like, "Hey, we heard Marshall Allen's piece, and we have decided to change our business practices."
Yeah, we decided that, you know what, we are selling too many of these drugs, and you shouldn't be throwing so many of them away. Yeah, it's unlikely that that's probably going to happen on its own. In this, that reminds me of this current story I did, really looked at the way eye drops are too large for our eyes, and vials of cancer drugs are much larger than they need to be. And in both cases, that results in a lot of wasted liquid medicine that's costing us a lot of money. But with the eye drop example, it's particularly interesting because, your eye can only hold a certain amount of liquid in it. And they make eye drops. Many eye drops are 2 or 3 times bigger than what your eye can even contain. So when that liquid runs down your face or you have to wipe it off your cheek after you put in an eye drop, it's not because you missed. It's because the eye drop is probably just too big for your eye. So back in the early 90s, the drug company Alcon created what they called a microdrop. It was a small eye drop that was able to, eliminate any waste. It worked just as well as the bigger eye drop. This was for glaucoma, and it was less irritating because it was a smaller drop, so it had less irritant in it. And the drug company ended up doing a study showing that it was effective, showing that it would reduce waste. But when it came to bringing it to market, they decided not to do it because they were concerned about how it would affect their profits. And so this is going back to your point about, is the industry just going to change itself? they're going to do what they're incentivized to do, and what they really want to do is bring in revenue and make money. And when patients and consumers don't even know about all this waste, it's pretty hard for us to say that it needs to stop.
So, all right, let's and certainly the waste comes in a lot of different ways. Let's walk through this, because we can also have like a procedural waste too, right? I mean,
sure. So, there's so many different examples. I mean, I looked at some different ones in this series. Like with procedures, I didn't dig into that in this particular series of stories, but a lot of the operations that are performed are not necessary. A lot of the stents that are put into people's hearts, or vascular stents that are put into people's legs, they find that those are unnecessary. Looking at screening, I mean, a lot of mammograms are not necessary. The PSA test for prostate cancer the recommendations are that there's not evidence that shows that it's more beneficial than it is harmful. But there's still lots of doctors out there recommending PSA tests. And these have different recommendations for different age groups. I recommend people check out the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force, because that's a group of volunteer experts who review the evidence for screening, and then they show which ones are recommended based on evidence and which ones are not. In my stories, I looked at, one of the stories looked at the perfectly good things, brand new, unexpired, in their original packaging that hospitals throw away. So I went up to a warehouse in Maine where it was filled, a 15,000 square foot warehouse filled floor to ceiling with pallets and shelves of hospital supplies and hospital equipment. I saw one pallet full of boxes of sutures, and each box of sutures cost a couple $100. I mean, these are very specialized stitches that are used in the operating room, and there were pallets of them just having been discarded from a hospital. I looked at drugs being thrown away in nursing homes. Nursing homes prescribe drugs to patients, and then the patient has the drug discontinued. It's in a sterile package. It was dispensed by a pharmacist. They just take those, pop them out of the sterile packaging, and flush them down the toilet. But in some states, like Iowa, they send them back to a pharmacist, and they redistribute them to uninsured patients who can't afford their medication. So you look all around us, when you start looking and start asking people, this wasted healthcare spending is everywhere.
Let's talk about just briefly about the cancer drug that is a liquid drug that is wasted.
Yeah, so in my story, I could have looked at a lot of them, but the one I really looked at is called Herceptin, and Herceptin is mostly used for breast cancer treatment. It's made by a drug company called Genentech. And up until earlier this year, it was dispensed in a multi-use vial. That just means that it was a larger vial that could be used by more than one patient. And that way, there wasn't as much waste associated with it, because if one patient didn't use the whole bottle, they could use the rest of the drug for the next patient. Now, this is a really expensive drug. Each milligram of the drug costs about $9, and the typical patient might use 330 milligrams of the drug. So you're looking at a lot of money per treatment for the drug, say around $3,000 per treatment. Right. And they would do a treatment every, say, 21 days. Now, Genentech decided instead of using the multi-use vial, they would switch and do a single-use vial. And the single-use vial is only 150 milligrams. So I know I'm asking you to do a lot of math here with me, but the point is, if you have a typical patient who uses about 330 milligrams, and they only distribute it in 150 milligram single-use vials, you end up using 450 milligrams, which means 120 milligrams is left over from that patient's treatment, and that drug just gets thrown in the trash can, and that bill for the drug gets sent to the patient. So in a case like that, you're looking at, upwards of around $1,000 worth of waste being billed to the patient just for that single treatment. And so when they made this announcement, the cancer care community went bananas. I mean, on message boards online, pharmacists and cancer care people around the country were saying, how can they do this? Don't they know that making this change is going to lead to an incredible amount of expense just in wasted medicine being billed to patients. But the bottom line is the drug company can kind of distribute it the way they want to. There's
Marshall,
nobody
hold on.
out there
Let's
saying
take
they
a break
can't do
here.
it.
Let's take a break,
Yeah.
because I want to ask him when we get back whether or not that's a feature or a bug. When they change the amount of cancer medication they put in a bottle, and you've got all these cancer caregivers saying, "Hey, wait a second, this is going to create a lot of waste." If those cancer caregivers think that they're telling the company something they don't know, or if the company's basically saying, "Yeah, no kidding," we got to take a quick break. We got to take a quick break. I'm talking to Marshall Allen. My name is Sam Seder. This is Ring of Fire Radio.